Joining me now, Tim O'Brien, Senior Executive Editor at Bloomberg Opinion and an MSNBC political analyst. He's the author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. Latasha Brown, the Atlanta-based co-founder of voting rights group Black Voters Matter. And Anthony Michael Kreis, Assistant Professor of Law at Georgia State University. Anthony wrote a New York Times op-ed this week discussing Trump's Georgia indictment titled, "With the latest Trump indictment, mind these lessons from the South." Thank you all for joining me. Anthony, let me start with you. Since the indictment was released, right-wingers, Trump supporters have been trying to make the case that Fani Willis is charging Trump for acts that aren't actually crimes. We saw conservative Greg Price do this on Twitter the other day, tweeting things that are now illegal according to the Georgia indictment, asking people for phone numbers, reserving rooms in a building, telling people to watch TV, getting people to attend hearings. Now, while it's true that those acts alone aren't crimes, they can become part of a larger criminal conspiracy like the one in this indictment. Could you briefly break that down for our viewers?
Absolutely. So there are oftentimes in conspiracy-based charges or conspiracy-based crimes, lots of acts which are on their own not unlawful. So, for example, if two people go to a bar and they decide they're going to rob a bank, and one says, "I'm going to get the getaway car," and the second one says, "Okay, I'll get the other materials we need." If that first person after that conversation decides to actually rent the car, renting a car, of course, on its own is not unlawful. But now you've taken that, those two people have taken an act in furtherance of that conspiracy. And so this is not unusual. It's not something that's specific to Donald Trump. It's pretty much standard course criminal law.
Yeah, and they're trying to make these acts sound anodyne and unconnected to anything else and hope that their base won't notice. Tim, Donald Trump is clearly not taking this fourth indictment too well, though. He's been acting completely delusional on social media, I should say more delusional than usual, attacking Fani Willis, calling the indictment rigged, part of a witch hunt. I can't help but wonder, could these social media tantrums, daily tantrums, be evidence for the first time in his, 77 years of life, Donald Trump really does feel like his back against the wall, that unlike the much-hyped Mueller inquiry, perhaps, this time he's finally feeling the stress of actually being held legally accountable?
I think that's absolutely right. There's this myth, Mehdi, that has clung to Donald Trump, that he has 9 legal lives and that he routinely escapes the long arm of the law. And he's had a history in his business and political life of escaping accountability. And therefore, it's impossible to actually bring him to court and seek justice. But the reality is, the only other time he was subject to a federal prosecution was in the early 1970s when the Justice Department investigated him and his father for racial discrimination. Then decades passed with Donald Trump essentially weaponizing the legal system for media purposes and for business purposes to intimidate business competitors, the press, clients, his own lawyers sometimes. And he's never been subjected to a thoughtful, well-resourced prosecution at both the federal and state level by prosecutors who have unearthed a flotilla of evidence that is damning and forms a very clear narrative that suggests an abundance of criminal acts. And he's never had the reality of then having to go into a courtroom and defend himself. And he's also abysmal under oath. My lawyers, when he sued me, my lawyers put him under oath. And he's an attorney's worst nightmare under oath. In the E. Jean Carroll case, he blew up his own defense under oath. So you've got someone in waters he's never swam in before, who is going to be, I think, a dangerous client to have in a courtroom. And of course he's nervous, but he's not listening to anybody because his other great failing is that he thinks he knows better about everything. So he's not taking counsel from anyone, and he thinks he can litigate this on social media. And already the judges are warning him to stop, as Judge Chutkan has in the January 6th case at the federal level.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the E. Jean Carroll. I think that was where he said, she's not my type, but then identified her in a photo as his second wife.
Yes.
Classic Trump. Latasha, I want to talk about Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss for a second. They, of course, as I mentioned, are the two Georgia election workers, the mother and daughter, viciously targeted by the Trump campaign, by Giuliani, by right-wing media. And I've got to ask, in your opinion, how much of the targeting of them, how much of the talk of riggers, this is a phrase that Trump used recently, and illegal votes in places like Atlanta is about race? is about the people being black?
You know, I think Trump has been quite consistent with what I call his three-legged stool strategy. He has always used race, sexism, racism, sexism, and literally weaponizing untruths. And that's what he did in this case. He targeted these women. They were black women. He actually attached them to words like they were a hustler. He attached, and we saw these viral videos that attached them to, there was cocaine, where they were passing a mint to each other. So at the end of the day, what he does, and he is consistent around this, around weaponizing race, weaponizing sexism, because what we know is he's vicious towards women, as we saw him with Hillary Clinton and others. And then he also, at the end of the day, he weaponizes untruth. The interesting thing about all of this, though, is I think that the moral, you know, and the paraphrase what Dr. King says, is that there is, while there is a legal dimension to this, there is also a moral dimension to this. And the moral arc always lends towards justice. And I think what we're going to see is we're going to see him being held to account. The truth will set you free because it does hold you to account. And in this circumstances, I think he's going to be held to account.
We can only hope. Anthony, on the subject of accountability, a lot of people believe that Trump will try to get his Georgia case moved to a federal court on the grounds that he was a federal official at the time of these alleged crimes. What are the odds of that actually happening, and how could that impact the proceedings? Would Fani Willis still be able to prosecute the case if it's moved out of Georgia? Would the trial still be televised, as it will be in Georgia?
That's a great question. So it's not really clear exactly what will happen with this removal question, in part because the standard and the threshold for removal is very low. That said, the idea that Donald Trump was acting in his official presidential capacity when he was attempting to overthrow the election and to, count out ballots in violation of Georgian civil rights, I think that is a stretch. But that said, as well, there is an argument to be made that the president does have a duty under the Constitution to ensure that elections are free and fair. And so we'll have to see how this shakes out in federal court. If it does get removed to federal court, Fani Willis will still be prosecuting it, so that's very important. It'll just be a federal judge. It'll be a jury impaneled by the federal court that will be largely made up of individuals from Fulton County, but there will be some surrounding counties that will be included. But there will be no television because the Northern District of Georgia is particularly, sensitive to technology being brought into the courtroom. So unlike the Fulton County Courthouse, where transparency and broadcasting is the norm, that is not true in federal court.
Tim, in addition to his social media tantrums, Trump is planning to hold, or he says he's going to hold, a press conference on Monday to address the Georgia indictment. He claims he will present a, quote, large, complex, detailed, but irrefutable report on the presidential fraud which took place in Georgia. ABC News is now reporting that a lot of people on Trump's legal team are unsurprisingly trying to get him to cancel the appearance because it could make him legal problems worse. You mentioned a moment ago he's a nightmare for a defense attorney. When he speaks, he undermines their legal case. But just put the law to one side for a moment, just politically. Him relitigating the 2020 election as part of his legal defense is surely a boon to Democrats. I mean, I'm no fan of Ron DeSantis, but he said this week that if we spend the 2024 election going back over 2020, we will lose. And he's right, isn't he?
I think he is right at the national level, and he is wrong in the primary season. I think Donald Trump holds an insurmountable lead.
I was talking general. I was talking general.
But but I think, DeSantis is interested in saying that is he needs to throw as many Hail Mary passes as he can right now to resurrect a failed candidacy. I don't think Donald Trump can win at the national level. I think the core voters that are going to determine that are independents, moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans who decide they can't stomach Donald Trump, and they're going to vote in a different direction. And I think if Fani Willis's court case is televised, if it's televised prior to to November, I think that is going to be as detrimental to his fortunes at the national level as the January 6th hearings were once those were televised. A lot of the polls now and the ratings numbers we're seeing and people's response to these different cases are happening in a vacuum. Prosecutors haven't had a chance yet to tell their story in public, so to speak. And I think Trump recognizes that, and that's why he's trying to get out in front of this early with these inane press conferences. But the other issue he's running is he's defying court orders not to talk about the case in public. And at some point, some of these judges are going to have to consider whether or not they're going to have to jail him in order to silence him. And that's going to be another interesting social and legal hurdle.
I'm going to come back to Anthony on that in 1 second. But, Latasha, while this is Trump's fourth indictment, it's still nothing to gloss over, obviously. Trump, our former president, GOP frontrunner, accused of trying to subvert the will of the voters. I mean, this is a huge, huge political issue. And yet Democrats, I believe, have been kind of absent from this conversation. The president wants to stay above the fray, doesn't want to look like he's interfering in the DOJ investigation. You know, elected Democrats always say we want to talk about kitchen table issues. Shouldn't the Democratic Party be making more of the fact that the GOP presidential frontrunner, there's a warrant out for his arrest right now?
Oh, absolutely. But I think even deeper than that, I think this still points to a greater problem in this country. The problem that we have is we have an eroding democracy. That ultimately for a president, for someone to be accused of the things that he's accused of, that has cases in four different courts, and to be the front runner for running for president, that says something is fundamentally wrong. The fact that the president can actually throw it to women and actually create a traumatic experience to target them for doing their civic duties, women who are courageous, who are doing a service to this democracy, that in itself says something is wrong. We need to recognize that this is beyond Trump, that while, yes, Trump is the target right now, and he's being called to account, he and the 18 other co-conspirators that he's working, that he's in this case with, that there is a fundamental problem with the fragility of democracy in this country, and we're going to have to do something to strengthen voting rights and to protect election workers and to make sure that this system has a democratic process that has integrity and is inclusive.
Anthony, quick last question to you. We're out of time, but I've got to ask. On Wednesday, we learned that a woman in Texas was arrested for threatening a judge, Tanya Chutkan, the judge in the Trump D.C. election interference case. In addition to calling Chutkan the N-word and referring to her as a slave over voicemail, the Texas woman also said, quote, "If Trump doesn't get elected in 2024, we are coming to kill you." So clearly a Trump supporter. If you're the judge in that situation and you're getting threats like this from supporters of the defendant who keeps inciting them, what do you do?
That's a good question, because I think Judge Chutkan doesn't want to really make herself the story here. And there are plenty of other ways to prosecute people who make threats against judges without making the judge the center of the story. So it remains to be seen what she'll do. But I think if Donald Trump continues to inflame individuals, then he might be facing some sanctions down the road.
I think she's also threatened a speedy trial, which I, for one, am all in favor of. Tim O'Brien, Latasha, Anthony, thank you all. Appreciate your analysis.